On April 12, 1961, at around lunchtime, First Lieutenant Yuri Gagarin had just given his first autograph. He gave it to someone who had helped him put on his spacesuit. He was then given his identification card, a revolver, and a knife. He was reminded not to shoot at polar bears because it only makes them angry, to throw flat things at sharks because it gets them confused, and to shut up at foreigners because they are foreigners. With him was Yevgeny Karpov, a colonel in charge of training. Gagarin was helped to put on his helmet, and Karpov was struck by a sudden thought. What if he doesn't end up in the polar circle with the bears, and he doesn't end up in the sea with the sharks, and he doesn't end up in a Western country with foreigners either, but in his own Soviet Union, and he's mistaken as a spy? What if an honest Soviet comrade unknowingly attacks the most important man of the day? The bus was waiting outside and there was no time for better ideas, so Karpov took a can of paint and a brush and hand-painted the initials SSSR right on Gagarin's helmet. The paint dried on the way to the rocket. My name is Alex Teva and you're listening to the Soviet Space Saga. The letters SSSR look in the Cyrillic alphabet like the letters CCCP, and they refer to the name of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Worried about what might happen with the first human being in space if he made it safely back, didn't start with the helmet. If you remember from episode 3 of this podcast, the one with the space dogs, many Soviet spacecraft included on board a bomb that was supposed to go off in case the object were to become dangerous or to land outside the Soviet Union. The existence of such a bomb on the first manned mission was actually discussed in earnest, and the representative for the KGB argued quite powerfully that yes, Gagarin should be killed if he, for example, decided to defect. In a rare show of opposition to the KGB, nobody else agreed, and there was no bomb. Of all the things that could kill Gagarin, at the very least the Communist Party was temporarily off the list. But the list was still really long. In 1961, no human being had ever been too far from planet Earth in the entire history of the human species. Nobody knew what the effects could be. Doctors and biologists were sufficiently convinced after so many experiments with animals, that the heart wouldn't stop working, that blood would still be flowing, and that it would still be possible to breathe and swallow. But psychologists didn't have much to go by. The physiology of dogs may be somewhat close to that of humans, but the dog's mind is not like ours. There were experts who said that breaking the bond between human and planet Earth would tear off the fabric of consciousness, that it would cause man to go mad. Even a small degree of madness would have been unacceptable if it was serious enough to overcome love of socialism. This kind of uncertainty had all kinds of implications. For example, it made it very difficult for both the Americans and the Soviets to decide on how to choose the future spacemen. In the United States, all kinds of people were taken into consideration, like adventurers, Everest mountain climbers, and so on. Eventually the decision was made to take in test pilots, all men in their 30s with huge flight experience, fantastic ability to think on their feet, and a certain approach to the risk of death. In the Soviet Union, the word cosmonaut, invented in 1955, was beginning to attract potential occupants for the job. There was a stage in the late 50s where the Soviet Academy of Sciences was flooded with letters from people all over the Union who wanted to volunteer. They included regular workers, journalists, and convicted criminals. Like their rivals, the Soviets also went through a list of potential occupations that might be close to flying in space, but in the end, like their rivals, settled on fighter pilots. In this way, they skipped whatever research the Americans had done, and at the same time adopted the same solution, hoping to turn the space race into a race between pilots, something that anyone could wrap their heads around. But the Soviet manned program differed from the American one in at least one very important aspect. The Soviet ships would be on autopilot, except for emergencies. So the cosmonauts didn't need the minimum of 1,500 hours that the American Mercury candidates had to have. It was enough if they could fly. Much more focus was placed, on the other hand, on them being fantastically fit, fantastically presentable, and utterly obedient in all respects. In addition to that, they had to be young and no taller than 170 centimeters, because otherwise they wouldn't fit in the Vostok space capsule. It should be noted that the American space capsule was even more cramped than the Soviet one, and the Americans had imposed their own height limit. John Glenn, the fifth human in space, used to say that, quote, "You don't climb into the Mercury capsule, you put it on." Armed with a set of selecting criteria, in the summer of '59, 10 years before the famous Bryan Adams song, the Soviets began looking far and wide for a bunch of cosmonauts. Their initial candidate pool was made of 3,461 solid Soviet citizens. Dr. Vladimir Yazdovsky was put in charge, and he decimated the candidate pool to 352. At that point, Yazdovsky started sending pairs of doctors through the Union to meet the 352 candidates and further filter them down. Two such doctors found their way to a place called Luostari, a few kilometers from the border with Norway, a small town which had once been part of Finland. Because of its position, it had seen a lot of wars, and in 1959 it was still of huge strategic importance, because it was home to a regiment of aviation that was the closest military presence to NATO that the Soviet Union had. The two visiting doctors arrived at the base with a list that had 11 names on it. They took over the headquarters and had a chat with each of the 11 pilots. They chatted about hobbies, about books, and about life in the Air Force. The 11 people could not have been more confused. 2 days went by, and 2 of the 11 were called again, and this time they were told what was going on. They were asked if they would be interested to fly in space, and they both said yes. One was called Georgy Shonin, and the other's name was Yuri Alexeyevich Gagarin. Gagarin was born in 1934 in a small place in the far west of Russia. He had a brother and a sister, and when he was 2, he got another brother, Boris. In 1941, his tiny village was occupied by the Germans in the Second World War. They burned down nearly everything and kicked the Gagarin family out of their house. Then the family went through something so horrific that it's difficult to describe in just a few sentences. One day, a German soldier who was even less human than most of them simply took 5-year-old Boris, wrapped a scarf around his neck, hanged him on a tree, and left. With all the powers of a 7-year-old brother, Yuri rushed and fought to undo the knot while yelling for his parents. Their mother arrived just in time to cut Boris off from the tree. He was not dead yet. For a long time he couldn't walk or sleep. He committed suicide 36 years later, sick with cancer, having tried and failed to make something of his life, while his brother shot to fame. This isn't something that Gagarin often talked about, but it must have influenced him terribly, and it could well be the reason for what many people who have met him described as a dark side. At some point, the Germans were driven out, and the family recovered a little. Yuri's father, Alexei Gagarin, was a fantastic handyman, and with the need to rebuild after the war, he became incredibly busy. He literally took their old house and moved it by ox cart to the slightly bigger settlement of Jatsk. At the same time, young Gagarin moved to Saratov to study foundry work. He was an avid student, read hundreds of books besides the school material, learned to play the trumpet, became a photographer, acted in musicals, and did every sport that was available. He even captained the basketball team, despite being the shortest in it. Another thing he did was to join the Saratov Flight Club, and even made it to the cover of a magazine, which ironically was hardly ever mentioned in his biographies, because Stalin soon became an official bad guy, and the name of the magazine was The Young Stalinist. Such is life. In 1955, he went to an Air Force school in Orenburg, and in 1957, he met Valentina Garyacheva while they were both visiting Moscow. Valentina had herself graduated in Orenburg as a medical technician. She liked Yuri, and he liked her, so 6 months later, they were married. Soon after that, he graduated as lieutenant in the Soviet Air Forces and was posted to Lostari, where he was recruited as a potential cosmonaut. And so, in October 1959, Gagarin arrived at the aviation hospital in Moscow, where a team of doctors were tasked with what today can best be described as selection by torture. The candidates were subjected to tests that the Catholic Inquisition would probably be envious about. Still, far from being a mark of Soviet sadism, many of these tests were in fact borrowed from what the Americans were doing at the same time. The United States was, of course, publishing more or less everything that was going on, while the Soviets took notes and did their own tests in secret. The candidates were admitted to the hospital and warned carefully not to talk to anybody about what was going on. What was in fact going on was kind of gruesome. They were baked at 70 degrees Celsius, not for a minimum amount of time, but until they couldn't take it anymore. They were starved of oxygen, made to stand in buckets of ice, and had water injected straight into their ears. They were shaken by vibration devices until their teeth, and presumably their brains, started rattling in their heads. The element of risk wasn't all in the subjects, part of it was in the technology. They were tested, for example, in centrifuges to see how much acceleration they could withstand, and this in old centrifuges that had to be chained so they wouldn't fly off into the walls. Soon there were only 20 people remaining, and after a few more months, 6. Then one of them was replaced after he developed some minor problems in the centrifuge. Another one had a diving accident, and he was replaced as well. The cosmonauts were called the Vanguard 6. Their names were Bykovsky, Nikolai, Pavlovich, Nelyubov, Titov, and Gagarin. After all these tests, it was time to start training, and they began with the physiology of spaceflight, or as much of it as was known at the time. In the third day of lectures, a man entered into their classroom. He was a large man with a short neck, spreading energy and with the general allure of power. The man was Sergey Pavlovich Karalov, the most closely guarded secret of the Soviet space program. Witnesses to that meeting tell the story that Karalov called up everyone by name, but when he arrived at Gagarin, he stopped and lingered for a few moments. It is said that at that point Gagarin already became the favorite. A few days later, Karalov introduced the 6 cosmonauts to the Vostok capsule that was supposed to carry them around the Earth. As he showed them the mock-up, he invited each candidate to step in. When Gagarin's turn came, he respectfully took off his shoes before entering the clean capsule. This little thing spoke to Karalov more than 100 party recommendations. As a man who nearly froze to death in a Stalinist gulag, he understood humility better than anyone present. Gagarin passed the test and was rated outstanding, same as Nikolai, Pavlovich and Titov. German Titov and Yuri Gagarin soon became the two most likely candidates for the role of first human being in space. Even before an official decision was made, it was sort of accepted. But the official decision was in the hands of a man who deserves his own introduction. General Nikolai Pietrowicz Kamanin was the head of the Soviet Cosmonaut Corps for 11 years, starting in 1960. He began his career as a pilot and became hero of the Soviet Union when in 1934 he helped save 34 sailors who were stranded in the Arctic Sea. To do that, he famously flew a two-seater biplane, landed it on the ice, and flew again with 4 people on board, and then with 6, and did this several times. He even rescued some of the dogs. Kamanin continued his exploits as a wartime aviator and was gradually promoted to general. When Romania changed sides in 1944, all of the Romanian air forces were placed under Kamanin's command, who led them against Germany. So, when he was put in charge of the new cosmonauts, Kamanin was, for all intents and purposes, a great example of a true socialist. He was successful, organized, capable and trustworthy. Nobody would have suspected him of breaking one of the most important laws that were governing his work, but he did. In 1960, Nikolai Kamanin started keeping a secret diary. What later came to be known as the famous Kamanin's diaries were in the most part kept secret until 13 years after his death, but after they did become public, they became the only sources we often have for what really happened inside the Soviet space program. They are a fantastic read in and of themselves, but right now let's focus on what Kamanin wrote about German Titov and Yuri Gagarin. Titov, writes Kamanin, is a stronger character than Gagarin, much more suited to the longer and more difficult second mission. But only the historians will remember the second man in space. The decision on who should be first haunted Kamanin every day. Titov and Gagarin were famously good friends. They were neighbors, they shared a balcony and were often together. They went through all their training together and shared similar ideas about space. Their wives were close friends as well, and they became even closer when, tragically, Tamara and German Titov lost a son at the age of 8 months. But beyond this close friendship lay some major incompatibilities. Gagarin was hugely charismatic with his famous smile and open nature. Titov was not quite the son of the Soviet Union that the communists wanted as the first human in space. For one thing, he came from a family that actually wasn't dirt poor. He was culturally educated and recited a lot of the famous Russian poet Pushkin. In fact, he did that to an extent that often annoyed people around him. He was more aloft, less compromising, and, as time proved, he was incredibly bad with public relations. He was an utterly dedicated family man who told his wife everything, including things that he had sworn not to. By contrast, Gagarin was playing by all the rules to an almost paranoid extent. He understood that he had a big chance at becoming the most important man in modern history, and everything he said or did was in support of that chance. Eventually, the difficult decision was made. Kamanin and Karalov chose Gagarin to fly first, with Titov as his backup. The Communist Party agreed, and the friendship between Yuri and German changed. Titov loved Gagarin and wished him nothing but the best, but at the same time he wished himself nothing but the best. and this inner conflict came to characterize their relationship forever. As Gagarin's backup, Titov hoped until literally the very last second that he could replace him. As they ate breakfast together in the morning of the launch, he hoped that. As they put on their spacesuits together, he hoped that. As they rode the bus to the rocket, he hoped that. As the hatch of the capsule closed, he still held a tiny sliver of hope. This sort of relationship was in many ways similar to what happened in the United States between John Glenn and Alan Shepard. But at the same time, there were differences between the cosmonauts and astronauts. Some were related to age. The astronauts were older and more experienced, while the cosmonauts were younger and in better shape. The astronauts were well off, living in luxury. They featured on magazine covers and received hundreds of letters every day. The cosmonauts, on the other hand, lived on the edge of poverty and were virtually unknown of. They had to be all that since their country was going to pretend they'd never existed in case their missions failed. Another big difference between astronauts and cosmonauts lie in the amount of freedom that they had. Freedom, not just in the political sense, but in the literal sense, was much more restricted for the cosmonauts. While the Americans had the option to control their spacecraft as pilots, this was considered to be far too risky for the Soviets. Karalov changed his mind about this less than a week before the launch. The cosmonauts were argued to be, in fact, experienced pilots and perfectly capable of performing their jobs. So he finally made the decision that the cosmonauts should be allowed limited control over the re-entry. He brought in Gagarin and Titov and made them train on the emergency re-entry procedure. In the United States, the astronauts had been training on this for all of 2 years, and they were all highly experienced test pilots. Here, the cosmonauts were, once again, at a disadvantage. What was more, manual control could only be permitted with the approval of the people on the ground. In absence of that, the cosmonauts were little more than passengers with no control over their fates. The question then was, how could this permission be enforced? To remotely unlock the controls in case of emergency was too risky, since it may well have been the actual radio that was part of the emergency. Someone had the idea to block the controls with a 3-digit code, then write the code on a piece of paper, put the paper in a sealed envelope, and place the envelope somewhere in the cabin. The thinking was that being able to find an envelope, open it, read the code and enter it on a control panel would be proof enough that the occupant wasn't space mad and could therefore be reasonably entrusted with his own life. Fear of defection still existed, but Gagarin was literally the most loyal communist they had been able to find in the entire Soviet Union. If somebody like him was going to defect, well, then there was probably no hope left for the Soviet people. But Karalov trusted Gagarin, and so did Kamanin, and so did other people. As soon as Gagarin entered the Vostok capsule on top of the world's biggest rocket and did a quick radio check, his friend Oleg Ivanovsky, who had helped him in, motioned him closer. In a tiny whisper, he told Yuri, "The numbers are 1, 2, 5. By any measure, this was a criminal act on Ivanovsky's part and could have landed him in serious trouble. But Gagarin smiled his usual broad smile and told him that he already knew. A few others had already told him. Ivanovsky then stepped back and began closing the hatch together with 2 assistants. There were 30 bolts to be fastened, and it took them a while. It was the morning of April 12, 1961. In the bunker that contained the control room, which was some distance from the launch pad, the tension was like a fog. The Soviet ground control was different from its American counterpart. There was no big room with screens and people in short-sleeved shirts. Here was a room with soldiers in front of big metal boxes that had lights and dials, with soundproofed headsets designed for tanks, and one man who actually used a periscope in order to see outside. Karalov himself sat alone at a separate table in front of a telephone and a microphone. Using the microphone, he could speak directly to Gagarin, although officially another cosmonaut, Pavel Popovich, was supposed to do that. Using the phone, Karalov could quickly give a secret password to abort the mission, but he could only do that within the first 40 seconds of the flight. Aborting the mission meant that another operator would send a remote command that would throw Gagarin out of the Vostok capsule tied to an ejection seat. It was quite unlikely to work, and what with the password and everything, it would probably be far too late to save him, even if he did eject. There was no abort button in the capsule like the Americans had. While the hatch was being closed, both Popovich and Karalov checked in with Gagarin a few times. Everything was going well, and the launch would happen in about an hour and a quarter. Suddenly, a technician yelled that a control light was not on. The hatch didn't appear to have been closed properly. That could mean that the ship wasn't airtight, which in turn would mean certain death for Gagarin and failure for the mission. Oleg Ivanovsky, who had just finished securing the last of the 30 bolts, was still on his platform on top of the rocket, together with his two colleagues. They started frenetically to undo their work, unfastening all 30 bolts at the highest speed they possibly could. The hatch weighed 60 kilograms, but one of the men, Ilya Kholstov, was renowned in their collective as a strong man. He was the right man at the right time. The hatch came off, and they barely caught a glimpse at Gagarin, who had his back at them, but was watching in a small mirror. Gagarin was whistling a popular song called "The Motherland Hears." Soon the hatch went back on. Inside the capsule, Gagarin suddenly spoke on the radio. "It would be nice with a bit of music," he said. Behind him, outside the capsule, the three-man team was fitting bolts faster than anyone had ever done it. Someone in the control room managed to find a love song called "Lilies of the Valleys" and played it over the radio. Gagarin approved. The six-armed team finally completed their work, and this time the seal checked out. The service tower was slowly pulled away from the massive rocket. The time was 30 minutes to launch. At 9 a.m., a siren began to sound across the launch pad, a final reminder that if any living being was still around, they had 7 minutes to get to a safe distance. Inside the capsule, Gagarin got ready. 3 minutes later, the order was given.
Ключ на старт. Ключ на старт. Есть старт.
Key to start. A few seconds later came the next one.
Ключ на дренаж. Ключ на дренаж. Есть дренаж.
Key to drainage. And then finally, Sergey Karalov said,
Зажигание.
Кетр, я заря-1. Зажигание.
Понял, дается зажигание.
ignition. The 5 engines of the huge R-7 rocket ignited together, causing the most incredible firestorm underneath the launch pad. Their 20 nozzles began ejecting hot gas at huge pressures, making a sound that caused the earth to rattle even some kilometers away. The very idea that a human being was in the middle of that controlled cataclysm seemed ridiculous. Gagarin's pulse raised to 157 beats per minute. At last, the 4 huge mechanical arms that had held the rocket suspended fell away, and the rocket slowly rose towards the sky. Gagarin famously yelled, "Поехали, let's go." 700 sensors aboard the rocket continuously sampled the environment. 50,000 times per second the vibration levels, 6,000 times per second engine performance. After 100 seconds, Karalov, forgetting or neglecting that Pavlovich was supposed to be the only one to speak with Gagarin, asked him how he was feeling. With his wonderful people skill, Gagarin responded, "I'm feeling good, how are you feeling?" After 2 minutes of acceleration, finally the first stage of the rocket fell off, and there was a brief respite. Then the main engine kicked in, pushing the rocket, which was now much lighter, to about 20,000 kilometers per hour. Gagarin was now unable to speak and he could hardly breathe, but it only lasted for about half a minute. After that, the cone of the rocket split in two, and through his tiny portholes, he could finally see outside. He was just over Siberia, almost 2,000 kilometers from the launch pad which he had left only 3 minutes earlier. And he was the first human being in space. But he was still going up. Even without an engine to push him, he was still climbing ballistically, but not fast enough to make it to orbit. For that, he needed the third stage engine. For that moment, though, he took in the marvelous view of the Earth from above. The word he kept repeating in his radio microphone was beautiful. When the third stage engine finally kicked in, the people who were in the control room later described Karalov as unrecognizable. He was stressed to the extreme, his voice cracked, and he was another man. It didn't help that soon Gagarin was quickly flying out of range of radio communication. Soon he had accelerated to an unbelievable 8 kilometers per second, which made him absolutely the fastest man in history, in addition to being the highest one as well. 11 minutes after launch, his engine shut down, and with that he was flying as fast as he would ever fly. That was it. The Soviets had put the first human being in orbit. Gagarin later described what he saw, and in his book called Beyond, Stephen Walker translated it to English. Quote, "I could see the horizon, the stars, the sky. The sky was utterly black. There were huge numbers of stars. Their brightness was made sharper against the blackness. I could see the very beautiful horizon. I could see the curvature of the earth. The horizon had a beautiful blue color. The very edge of the earth had a soft blue color which gradually darkened, turning to a shade of violet and then into black. Ever since humans existed, nobody else had seen these things. Also, nobody else had felt the weightlessness of orbital flight. Gagarin didn't go mad, he didn't die, and he didn't even go blind as the ophthalmologist had predicted that he might. What happened next was this.
Говорит Москва, говорит Москва. Работают все радиостанции Советского Союза.
This was the announcement that Radio Moscow made to the world. Translated to English, it said, "This is Moscow calling. We're broadcasting a statement announcing the world's first manned spaceflight." Then a small surprise. The pilot cosmonaut of the spaceship Vostok is a citizen of the United Soviet Socialist Republics.
Летчик-майор Гагарин Юрий Алексеевич.
Major Yuri Alexeyevich Gagarin. The surprise was in Gagarin's rank, which had been first lieutenant at launch and had turned into major by the time the announcement went out. The promotion had come directly from Khrushchev's own lips, and the fact that it went through the huge bureaucratic network of formal approvals at such incredible speed shows just how important Gagarin had suddenly become. It was in fact one of the fastest promotions in the entire history of the Soviet Air Force. After naming Gagarin, the press release went on to give the technical details and the orbit, and said that the pilot was feeling well. But this press release had been prepared well in advance. 3 releases had in fact been prepared. This would be the first one. The reason for it would be so that, quote, "it would exclude any foreign government from declaring the cosmonaut a spy," end quote. A second bulletin was prepared in case the cosmonaut should land safely, and a third in case he should end up in the sea. No press release would be issued in case of failure. In that case, the cosmonauts' existence would simply be erased and denied. The prepared release mentioned an altitude of 302 kilometers, and it was read exactly as written. But, as was often the case with Soviet press releases, this was not quite accurate. However, this time the lie wasn't intentional. Not quite everything had worked perfectly with the launch. The second stage engine didn't receive the shutdown command from the ground, and a backup device had to switch it off instead. When it did, it was a tiny fraction of a second too late. But even such a short time means a lot at that speed. Vostok's trajectory ended up all of 70 kilometers too high. That meant that the predictive little map that Gagarin had wasn't accurate any longer, since the capsule wasn't flying where the system assumed it was. And that meant that Gagarin wasn't exactly where he thought that he was. But without any precise navigation devices, he had no way of knowing that, and certainly nobody was going to tell him. So, when Gagarin happily announced over the radio that he was flying above the United States, he actually wasn't. In any case, the Radio Moscow broadcast took almost exactly 1 minute, and that minute marked the boundary between two eras in human history. People immediately began to gather in the streets. Trams and buses stopped in cities all over the Soviet Union so that people could hear the public loudspeakers. The huge Soviet industry nearly ground to a halt as workers stopped. At stores in Moscow, customers as well as employees were abandoning shopping and hugging each other. Everyone's eyes were upwards, where a Soviet comrade was flying at over 28,000 kilometers an hour. In Washington, the time was 2 in the morning. Every TV, newspaper, and news service ringed the White House at the same time, asking for comments from President Kennedy. But JFK was sleeping and had given the order not to be woken. So some of the journalists turned to other important players for comments. One of them ringed the NASA press officer, Colonel John Powers, at 4 in the morning. The colonel picked up the phone, cursed the reporter, and mumbled something about still being asleep. And so, in what many Americans thought was an entirely fitting headline, the early front pages carried the text: Soviets put man in space. Spokesman says US asleep. Meanwhile, Gagarin was flying around the planet. At every opportunity, he requested confirmation that his trajectory was fine, but the ground operators eschewed the answer, either because they didn't have it, or because they had it and were under orders not to make it public. Gagarin had gone through a dramatic entrance into the night, and half an hour later back into the day again. Having flown almost 16,000 kilometers, he was now above the South Atlantic and approaching Africa. The day began, as he described it later, as a beautiful iridescent rainbow rising from the edge of the earth. Suddenly the sun rose and the cabin filled with light. A timer aboard the capsule triggered a sun-seeking device to wake up, and the capsule automatically orientated itself by firing quick bursts of nitrogen so that its tail was against the sun. This maneuver was of crucial importance, and had it gone wrong, then Gagarin would have had to use his secret code 125 and attempt to do it manually. But after 16 minutes, the onboard systems were happy that the spacecraft was aligned for re-entry. Anticipating the burn of the braking engine, Gagarin still had no idea that he was on a wrong trajectory. The braking engine was basically a smaller rocket, whose purpose was to slow him down enough so that he would re-enter the atmosphere above a designated place at a very specific angle. Too shallow, and he would just bounce back into orbit. Too steep, and he would fall too fast and burn. The engine could only be started. It would then burn for a specific duration, and that was it. Even if the spacecraft had been on the ideal trajectory, it would still be risky. There was no second chance. But with the capsule 70 kilometers too high, the risks were even greater. A green light came on just before the engine fired. It started without a hitch and it burned for 40 seconds. Those 40 seconds of braking would reduce his speed from 8 kilometers per second to 7.8 kilometers per second, less than 2% slower, and yet enough to make him fall on Earth instead of around it. The engine stopped on cue, but all was not well. There was a valve which should have been shut when the engine started burning, but it hadn't shut all the way. Fuel leaked around it instead of burning in the engine, which meant it wasn't braking with enough force. In the event, it didn't even brake that 1.6%. When the burn stopped, he was still flying 14 kilometers per hour too fast. Try to imagine these numbers. The capsule was flying 8 kilometers every second, had barely braked at all, but not quite as much as it needed. By how much? By the speed of a bicycle. And yet that was enough to mess things up. What happened next had been kept a secret for 30 years. During these 30 years, Gagarin's flight had always been presented as flawless. But this last stage was anything but. The capsule began to spin, doing one full spin once every 10 seconds. Gagarin hadn't expected this. 10 seconds later, the capsule should have separated from the braking engine, but it didn't. Time went by and still nothing happened. The device that was responsible for the separation should have triggered at a specific speed, and that tiny bit of extra speed caused it to just keep waiting. There was nothing that Gagarin could do. With so much extra mass and volume, the spacecraft was spinning out of control, and the prospect of an awful death was becoming more and more likely even as more and more millions of people underneath him were celebrating his success. In the face of this situation, Gagarin did exactly what was expected of him. He remained calm. He was collected enough to send a message in Morse code telling that the separation failed. And unbelievably, he also mentioned the view, but he did not declare an emergency. What would have been the point? After a few more minutes, the tumbling Vostok finally re-entered atmosphere, if only the outer fringes of it. It was enough at that speed for friction to happen, and the ship became hot. Nobody knows for sure why and how, even though lots of people have speculated, but once things got heated, another backup system correctly interpreted the temperature as presence of atmosphere, and in some way that information overrode the speed indication. With a loud bang, separation occurred, and Gagarin's round capsule uncoupled itself from the braking engine. Keeping them together, there were 4 straps made of steel and an electrical cable. The steel straps had given way, but the cable hadn't, and for a few seconds the capsule carrying Gagarin fell, still connected by a simple cable to the other section. Once again, heat helped. It melted through the cable and separation was finally complete. But it was 12 whole minutes later than scheduled. The capsule now fell through thicker and thicker air. It flew, quite literally on fire, above Turkey and the Black Sea, reaching temperatures high enough to melt metals. The capsule had a heat shield that protected the man inside, but despite that, the man inside could now smell something burning. All he could see outside was fire, and to top that, the acceleration was brutal. Gagarin experienced an incredible 10G, meaning that he felt 10 times heavier. He was breathing in short, labored grunts, and he was on the verge of losing his eyesight. As the acceleration continued even beyond this point, his heart was unable to pump blood into his brain, and Gagarin was approaching loss of consciousness. Anyone less trained on the centrifuge would have collapsed long ago. But finally, the air slowed the capsule enough, and the acceleration forces dropped. Soon the capsule became merely supersonic. After falling for hundreds of kilometers, with only 7 kilometers left to the ground, another automated system decided it was safe to eject. 3 small explosive charges went off in the hatch behind Gagarin, and 2 seconds later, he was thrown out of the capsule, still tied to his seat. A series of parachutes opened, and by an amazing coincidence, Gagarin recognized the place underneath him. It was Saratov, where he had gone to foundry school. He recognized the meanders of the Volga, the hills, even some houses. At 10:53 in the morning of April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin landed on a field next to a woman and a little girl. He had flown around the planet in 106 minutes. He was alive and well. He was the most important man in the world, and he had just scared away that woman and the little girl. It took a few hours for Gagarin to meet with officials of the Soviet army, but the capsule remained behind him on the field. It was about to be the protagonist of yet another Soviet lie. Months earlier, it had been decided that this mission would be registered for a series of historical world records. One of these was the World Altitude Record. The problem was that the official international body who would grant this record had some important rules, and one of them was that the person doing the record should land in the same vehicle in which he or she had taken off. But Gagarin had ejected at 7 kilometers above the Earth. This, therefore, had to be kept secret. The Soviet Union, like most countries, had a sport commissar, whose job it was to make official statements about the supposed records. His name was Ivan Borisenko. Without even seeing the landing site of Vostok, Borisenko signed a certificate saying that Gagarin had landed inside his capsule. With utter dedication to the cause, Borisenko stuck to his lie for decades, even though there had been witnesses to the landing, and of course everyone involved in the project knew it was a lie. In fact, reporters made the mistake of asking the witnesses about the landing, and the witnesses made the mistake of telling the truth. Even the official Soviet news agency TASS made a blunder and accidentally told the truth once, before figuring it out and quickly removing it. In fact, the lie was upheld for about 30 years. But none of that mattered at the time. The Soviets had put a man in space, and that was an unbelievable achievement that topped the list of space race achievements until the Americans put one of theirs on the moon 8 years later. The impact of the Soviet success was colossal. It became the biggest news all across the world. Gagarin, now a major before even he was aware of it, became a Soviet asset. As such, he was paraded across the globe, facing huge celebrity. In the United States, the news was on everyone's lips. Every single newspaper in the country carried headlines like, "Soviet orbits man and recovers him." At that moment, America had lost the space race. The progressive, democratic capitalism had lost to the godless socialists. People were annoyed and dismayed, some of them beyond limit. One of the Americans who really took it badly was President Kennedy. At his press conference on the afternoon of the same day, when asked about the Soviet achievement, the president stumbled. If you watch the news footage, he looks disoriented and not in control. He struggles to form a coherent sentence while looking down.
President, could you give us your views, sir, about the Soviet achievement of putting a man in orbit and what it would mean to our space program as such?
Well, it is a most impressive scientific accomplishment, and also I think that we, all of us, as members of the race, have the greatest admiration for the Russian who participated in this extraordinary feat. I have already sent congratulations to Mr. Khrushchev, and I send congratulations to the man who was involved.
As author Stephen Walker notices, Kennedy was so stressed that he said members of the race instead of members of the human race. But most tellingly, he couldn't bring himself to say Gagarin's name. Instead, he called him the man who was involved. With someone like Kennedy, this was relevant, and it was a measure of how distraught the American president was at losing the space race. Celebrations continued across the world, but evidently nowhere as lively as in Moscow. The Soviet capital was seeing what was the largest party in its history. Unknown people were hugging and kissing each other on the streets, and the euphoria was bordering hysteria. Yuri Gagarin and his wife Valentina had just been invited to a magnificent reception at the Kremlin, where he received the Order of Lenin and the Gold Star medals. They were to be only the first ones in a long series of medals and decorations. The town of Gzhatsk, where Gagarin had spent his childhood, was renamed Gagarin. In fact, 3 more towns in the Soviet Union took the same name. A crater on the far side of the moon was named Gagarin, as was an asteroid. There's even an ice hockey trophy called Gagarin Cup. Countless poems and songs have been written about the event. Now, 60 years later, with the moon landings behind us, it can be hard for us to appreciate the magnitude of this accomplishment, just as it is hard for me to express it now. Once again, someone who completely got it was President Kennedy. 2 days later, while Gagarin was returning from the Kremlin, Kennedy held an emergency meeting with his advisors at the White House. He was despondent and on the edge of a panic. According to witnesses, he said, quote, "If somebody can just tell me how to catch up, let's find somebody, anybody. I don't care if he's the janitor over there, if he knows how." And that was when President Kennedy began to take seriously the idea that the US should send an astronaut to the moon. The cost suggested to him was huge, and in reality it would be much huger, but there was nothing else that JFK could think of that could top the Soviet accomplishment. It wasn't even a month before he made up his mind. The Americans were going to throw everything into the game. But the Soviets weren't about to give up either. This has been an episode of The Soviet Space Saga, a podcast written and produced by me, Alex Deva. If you like the way I tell stories, look up my books on Amazon. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, just send me a message. My website is alxx.se, and you'll find a link to it in the episode description. Thank you so much for listening.